Welcome to Teaching Truth. For me, the teachings of Christ and my own personal accountability before God provide a framework in which I try to lead my life. The humble and honest words of Her late Majesty, the Queen Elizabeth II, who we honoured and remembered yesterday, and who was laid to rest in a quiet corner of St George's Chapel in Windsor. For me, the teachings of Christ and my own personal accountability before God provide a framework in which I try to lead my life. Words that could well have been uttered by and attributed to Daniel who was on His Majesty's service. Daniel, who was a man committed to God and to living a life that was honouring of God. Daniel could well have said, for me, the teachings of the law and my own personal accountability before God provide a framework in which I try to lead my life. Yesterday, in our reflections under the theme A Historical Day, we looked at the day that Daniel faced, the day in which he faced a den of lions, a day on which he literally and physically stared death in the face. And today we want to look at the dynamic behind Daniel's life. And to help us do that, we're going to read just a few verses from Daniel chapter 6, from verse 10. King Darius has issued a decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except him, should be put into the lion's den. So when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Just as he had done before. You really do sense a conviction and a consistency about the spiritual life of Daniel, just as we saw a consistency in the life and in the spiritual life of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Because Daniel, in praying to God, wasn't about courting persecution and saying, come and get me. No, but Daniel was simply doing what had been built into his life over many years. Even when it was made a capital crime by the decree of Darius, Daniel still prayed, evidence of the dynamic, the spiritual dynamic within his life. Nailing his colours to the mast was what Daniel was about. He was prepared to stand up and be counted. For right at the heart and the centre of the life of this older man, over 80 years of age, Daniel, was the unhurried communion with God in prayer. Praying, note this, on his knees. A physical sign of his humility and his submission and reverence toward God. It was D.L. Moody who once said this, quote, "The Christian on his knees sees more than the philosopher on tiptoe." Daniel did not consider himself too important to pray. Daniel had been promoted within the kingdom, and yet he still put God first. Daniel would undoubtedly have been a very busy man with all the affairs of state, as it were. He would have had a lot of public duties that made demands on his time. He was older, as we said, his energy would be reduced. However, Daniel made no excuses when it came to the place of prayer. No matter how engaged he was in the duties of the various state offices for His Majesty the King, he kept his time with God as more sacred than any other duty. He ring-fenced that time. And he ring-fenced that time in a special place in his home where he met with God daily. In fact, we read 3 times a day. I ask it of myself as I ask it of you. Do we have that consistency to set aside time within our homes to meet and to pray with God daily? We ought never to consider ourselves too important to pray. We are the subjects of the King of Kings. And Daniel was not too involved to pray either. In this instant generation of instant news and instant coffee and instant everything, our time-saving devices actually have not saved us any time. They have created a sense we need to get more done and to create a busyness. But Daniel was not too involved to pray. He always took time to meet with God, even although he was in demand. It was Martin Luther, that great champion of the Reformation, who said this: "I have got so much to do today that I cannot possibly get through it with less than 3 hours of prayer." Well, maybe we can't pray for 3 hours in reality, but we can set aside time to meet with God in prayer and the reading of His Word, to create that time for family devotions. Daniel was not too involved to pray. And he was not too insecure to pray either. He was in the habit of praying with his windows open towards Jerusalem. He didn't draw the curtains, didn't put the blind down, he didn't go into another room. No, he opened the windows towards Jerusalem. And Daniel had to make a decision: either draw the curtains and be secure, or in a sense be insecure and open the windows towards Jerusalem. If Daniel had been an insecure man, he could well have given up on his daily prayer come day 2 rather than praying for 30 days. But he continued to pray because he was not too insecure to pray. He prayed towards Jerusalem, God's city, at the open window, knowing that his enemies would see him and knowing that they would probably, in all likelihood, report it to the king. Daniel had faith in God, and that overcame any insecurity he might have felt. Does our faith in God overcome any insecurity we may have? When we see Daniel before the open window calling before God, are we challenged, as it were, to go more public with our faith and to nail our colours to the mast as Daniel did? For Daniel, like us, lived as we do in a pagan and wicked society where the culture was one where he was having to deal with it spiritually. Daniel would not abandon his prayer life, even if it meant the end of his natural life. And Daniel finally was not too impolite to pray. When I was a child, one thing I was always taught to do and to always say was thank you when someone gave me something or did something nice for me. How many gifts have we received from God? How impolite is it for us to accept the gifts from God daily and then fail to thank him in prayer? And look what Daniel did. Daniel thanked God in prayer, giving thanks to his God. Daniel would not be so impolite as to fail in giving God gratitude every day for what God had already done in his life. Daniel's prayers were not just for wants and needs, a shopping list. No, Daniel's prayers were filled with praise and thanksgiving. The dynamic that was evident in Daniel's life, a man on his Majesty's service, is that dynamic evident in our lives.